am here with Dr. Nanay, Professor of Philosophy, University of Antwerp. Thank you so much, Dr. Nanay, for agreeing to talk with us about how mental imagery is some kind of larger kind, and implicit bias is a kind of mental imagery. In order for us to understand all of that, I hope to ask you some questions to break it down. So first,
sounds great. Well, thanks for inviting me.
My pleasure. What is mental imagery?
That's a very good question. Very good starting question as well. So here is one way of getting to what mental imagery is. Just close your eyes. Do close your eyes. You're not closing your eyes. And visualize an apple. Did you get it?
Mm-hmm.
So the kind of experience you have, that would be mental imagery. Do you get it? You have this kind of apple-y like something in front of your mind's eye. So that's one example of mental imagery. And that's the kind of mental imagery that's how philosophers usually introduce the concept, if they even bother to introduce the concept. So, close your eyes, visualize an apple, that would be mental imagery. I think that mental imagery is a wider concept. And that's the way the concept is used in psychology and neuroscience. And basically any kind of perceptual processing that is not directly triggered by input, by sensory input, that would count as mental imagery. So when you close your eyes and visualize an apple, you have perceptual processing of an apple, but the apple is not there. So that perceptual processing is not triggered directly by any kind of input. Your eyes are closed, right? You have no retinal image. So that would count as mental imagery, but lots of other things would count as mental imagery. For example, dreaming, that would count as mental imagery, because when you dream, you do have perceptual processing of your various dream images and sounds and stuff, but it's not directly triggered by sensory input, because again, there's no sensory input, your eyes are closed. There's a bunch of other kinds of mental imagery that I'd be happy to talk about, but that's the general idea. That's how psychologists and neuroscientists think of mental imagery, and that's the way I'm using the concept.
So even if there is an apple in front of me, if I stare at it long enough and I try to memorize what it looks like, when I close my eyes and imagine it, it's still mental imagery?
Yes, very good, because that's not then it's not directly triggered, right? So I'm looking at your image now on my computer, and that is perception, because my perceptual processing is directly triggered by the sensory input. That is the image of your face. Then I close my eyes, and then I try to visualize the way you look, and then it's going to, in some sense, my perceptual processing is going to be caused by your image, but not directly.
Right.
Indirectly. It's a bit this kind of big temporal delay.
So what is directly causing mental imagery?
Good. So excellent. So one blatant feature of this way of defining mental imagery is it's a negative definition. So it tells you what perceptual processing is not triggered by. It's not triggered by that sensory input, but it doesn't tell you what it is triggered by. And it can be triggered by basically three different kinds of things. It can be triggered by some kind of higher level processes, as in the case of visualizing an apple. So you close your eyes, you count to 3, and then you deliberately, in a top-down manner, from your higher level processes, trigger this perceptual processing, and that's what leads to the perceptual processing of the apple. It can also be triggered laterally, so from kind of sideways, when, for example, sensory stimulation in one sense modality triggers perceptual processing in a different sense modality. So when you watch the TV muted, that's an example for that. So first of all, I should have said this, that all the examples that we used so far were visual examples. So you close your eyes and visualize an apple. That's visual mental imagery. Mental imagery doesn't have to be visual. It can be auditory. So it can be, the tunes in your, earworms would count as mental imagery, auditory mental imagery. The tunes that go through your mind. There's olfactory mental imagery, when you somehow, there's perceptual olfactory stimulation, so the smelling processing that's going on, that's not triggered by sensory input. And, it can be tactile and so on. So back to what it is triggered by. So it can be triggered laterally, which just means that in sensory input in one modality, one sense modality, let's say vision, triggers perceptual processing in a different sense modality, say audition. So when you watch the TV muted and you watch someone whose voice, who you've seen a lot. So my go-to example is Barack Obama, who has a very distinctive tone of voice, and you watch him on TV and it's muted, and you actually do hear kind of his distinctive tone of voice in your mind's ear, as it were, while you're looking at the screen, right? So that's clearly your auditory perceptual processing is clearly not triggered by auditory input, because there is no auditory input, right? You're watching it muted. So it's triggered in a lateral way by the visual input. So that would be lateral. And maybe I'll leave the third way, the bottom-up thing.
Yes, I already have questions.
Yeah.
When you described the first way of having a direct cause of mental imagery, it sounded like you were giving us a lot of control over the mental imagery. Like if I sing to myself a song that I know, I'm controlling my mental imagery. But the second way, the lateral way that you discussed, makes me feel like we don't have much control over the mental imagery, because if I can't help but hear Barack Obama's voice, then I'm not as in control. So maybe you can tell us more about how much control we have over mental imagery.
Good, excellent. So so that's normally the next thing that I say about it. So when you close your eyes and visualize an apple, that is an example. It's undoubtedly an example of mental imagery, but in many ways it's an atypical example. In one way that it's atypical is that it's visual mental imagery, whereas mental imagery can be auditory, olfactory, and so on. Another way in which it's atypical is that it's voluntary mental imagery, right? You close your eyes, count to 3, and visualize an apple. This is it's an intentional action. It's something you do. And it's voluntary, something you do have control over. But again, that does not have to be the case. And dreaming would be one example where you don't have much control over your mental imagery. Earworms, another one, and so on. And the kind of Barack Obama example is a third one. So mental imagery may be voluntary or involuntary. And another distinction that I often make is that when you close your eyes and visualize an apple, the apple that you visualize is in this kind of weird visualized space, at least for most people, right? You close your eyes and there's this apple, but it's not really, there's no fact of the matter about how far away it is from the tip of your nose, right? So, but that's not a necessary feature of mental imagery. You can have mental imagery of something that's very much in your egocentric space. That's, you can have mental imagery of an apple right here in front of you, or right there, or back there behind you on the fancy sofa. So that's another way in which closing your eyes and visualizing an apple is atypical. And yet another way is the feeling of presence. So when you close your eyes and visualize an apple, you're not fooled into thinking that there is actually an apple in front of you, right? But there's other examples of mental imagery where it is the case that you have this kind of strong feeling of presence. For example, in the case of, at least in lucid dreaming. So that lucid dreaming is a kind of dreaming when you have this very strong feeling that something is right there in front of you. So yeah, so in all these ways, it's atypical. There's a last one that I'm kind of, I guess we're gonna get into anyway, and that's about whether the mental imagery is conscious or unconscious. So when you close your eyes and visualize an apple, that's gonna bring up a conscious mental imagery, at least for most people. But again, just as mental imagery can be voluntary or involuntary, it can also be conscious or unconscious. But I'm sure that you're gonna have more questions about that because it's controversial.
Yes, so let's just go there now. So you've already created these distinctions. One was the modality of mental imagery. There's different modalities. One was voluntary and involuntary mental imagery, and now you're bringing in conscious and unconscious mental imagery.
Yep.
So is the conscious and unconscious distinction related to the voluntary and involuntary?
It's related in something. It's a very different distinction, right? I mean, so an action can be voluntary or involuntary, and or conscious and unconscious. So you can definitely have involuntary mental imagery that's conscious. So so dreams,
like earworm example,
or earworms, or dreams, or even the Barack Obama. I call it multimodal mental imagery, when the imagery is triggered by the auditory imagery is triggered by the visual input. That's also going to be conscious but involuntary. It's an interesting question whether unconscious imagery can be voluntary. I'm not sure that I need to take sides on that, but there's at least three kinds. I mean, there's this cross-cutting distinction. I'm not 100% sure that there's going to be. So there's definitely going to be conscious voluntary mental imagery, right? It's going to be closing your eyes and visualizing an apple. There's going to be conscious involuntary mental imagery. Those are the examples that we talked about just now. So earworms, dreams, and the Obama example. There's going to be unconscious mental imagery, and I have a lot to say about this if you're interested. But those are going to be involuntary, at least the most typical examples. And I want to leave it an open possibility that there is actually no such thing as voluntary unconscious mental imagery.
Okay, interesting. Thanks for parsing those for us. So I'm curious if there is something about our past experiences that plays a crucial role here. Because if we, for example, haven't heard Barack Obama's voice before, then it's going to give us different outputs through these processes. So how much does our cognitive, our set of cognitive experiences or something play into these mental imagery distinctions?
So very much so, and I think that that's a really one reason why mental imagery is really an important topic for philosophers of mind, that it's an important mediator for top-down influences on perception. So exactly the Obama example. So you would not have the same kind of auditory mental imagery when we look at the Obama giving a speech muted if you didn't have this kind of higher level or background knowledge about how Obama sounds. So mental imagery is very much influenced by your previous background knowledge. I mean, it's enough to just think about this. When you close your eyes and visualize an apple, what kind of apple you're going to visualize is going to depend on what kind of apples you've encountered before. If you've only encountered red apples, then probably you're going to visualize a red apple, right?
Yes, and slightly, I don't know, deeper or tangential. If you love bananas or apples or Barack Obama or whatever it is, versus if you hate the object, does that also play a factor into how the mental imagery is?
Yes, so very good. So I guess that's yet another distinction that you can make, that mental imagery can be emotionally colored or not emotionally colored, or valenced or not valenced. And I think that's a kind of an important thing to think about, not just when you think about mental imagery, but also when you think about emotions, that mental imagery is one of the kind of really important carriers of emotion. So for example, when I ask you to imagine that just right there under your table, there's this vicious dog that's attacking your feet and that's trying to bite you, that's going to be very difficult to do that, to engage with that situation without having vivid mental imagery, and that imagery is going to be emotionally laden. So I think that there's mental imagery can be, and very often is, emotionally laden, and there's a lot of really cool empirical studies that show this kind of two-way interaction about how your emotions very much influence your mental imagery and your mental imagery influence your emotions. So there's this neat two-way interaction that I think is best explained by saying that just the content of mental imagery can be actually valenced. And by valenced, I just mean, emotionally charged.
Okay, so let's go towards this idea of implicit bias as mental imagery. But first, can you tell us what is implicit bias?
Yeah, so Implicit bias, there you go. Beautiful, beautiful. Excellent infographics. So implicit bias is this it has been a very fashionable topic in psychology and increasingly in philosophy as well. Maybe it's the best way to think about it is first to think about biases on our behavior. So certain behavior of ours is biased in the sense that it goes against our deeply held beliefs. So that's just that would be a bias. Now, there's different kinds of biases, and there's a giant literature in psychology about various cognitive biases. What makes the kind of bias that I'm interested in a narrower category is because, first of all, it's supposed to be implicit bias, so you're not at least not fully aware of it, that you have that. And second, the kind of implicit bias that made the headlines or that most philosophers and psychologists are interested in are biases towards certain racial and gender groups. So biases against people with certain skin color. And there's a fairly well-established set of findings according to which everyone, even if you think that you're the least racist person in the world, you will have certain biases towards certain people with different skin color from yours.
When we were talking about mental imagery in general, you said that there's a distinction we could make: conscious versus unconscious mental imagery. So when we're talking about implicit bias, is that tracking this distinction? Is implicit bias always unconscious, or how does that work?
Yeah, very good. So the original findings, there were the original findings of an implicit bias that really made the headlines. And they were saying that implicit bias is unconscious. And that was at a time when people were really going all in for much of them, our mind is an iceberg, and it's only like a tiny bit of it is visible, and most of it is underwater, and it's all unconscious, which I think is actually true, but it's a little methodologically more complicated about how we can keep the conscious and the unconscious apart, and in different scientific subfields. So people use a much stricter criterion in perceptual psychology, for example, when we talk about unconscious perception or unconscious attention, than, for example, in implicit bias when they're a little more lax. So, and then more recently, there's been a fair amount of findings that show that what we thought of as implicit bias is not so implicit. So people are kind of quite good at predicting how well they're going to do in this famous test that's supposed to measure implicit bias. So maybe it's not really the case that we really don't notice that we are biased. It's just that somehow we don't want to know. So here's the famous example, the kind of stereotypical example that you get in an elevator, not very 2021 example, but you get into this crowded elevator, and then you're somehow, there's a bunch of people, and there's people with different skin color, and you're just somehow you're standing in a way that you're further away from this person who has a different kind of skin color from yours than from this person who has the same skin color as yours. And so the classical explanation is that, well, even if your conscious part of your mind is just fully colorblind, non-racist, whereas your behavior goes against that, and you're not aware of your biases at all. Whereas it seems to be the case that you do notice what you're doing, right? And not stupid. So you do notice that you're, oh, wow, what did I do? I'm moving further away from this person. Why is that? It can be because I'm racist. I'm the least racist person in the world. But I don't want to know about it. That's not really, that must have been a coincidence or something like that. So I think there's more and more reason to think that implicit bias is not that implicit, or not implicit in the sense that it's just fully unconscious. But whether it's the same distinction, so because of these big debates about implicit bias, about just how unconscious it is, I think mental imagery is kind of a good fit, because mental imagery can be conscious or unconscious. So if implicit bias is kind of unclear where it is from the scale between consciousness and unconsciousness, then you can somehow make them mix and match, as it were.
So that's one way to support your idea that implicit bias is a kind of mental imagery, because you don't have to explain whether it's fully conscious, fully unconscious, something like this.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say that it really supports it, but it's, at least it doesn't. It's a good fit for that that explanatory role.
Okay, so I have a similar question, but with a different content about mental imagery. You said that it could be voluntary, and there's cases of mental imagery that are involuntary. What about implicit bias as mental imagery? Is the implicit bias something we can have voluntary and involuntary cases of?
No, so that's going to be involuntary, right?
Mm.
Implicit bias, the kind of mental imagery that's involved in implicit bias is going to be involuntary. So let me just go through a case just to make the point, because it seems like, mental imagery, that's just this perceptual phenomenon. I mean, it's perceptual psychologists who should be dealing with that, or rather neuroscientists, because really the way to establish whether you have mental imagery is to scan your prime visual cortex, as activation. That sounds very, very different from the kind of social psychology stuff that's about implicit bias. So how do we connect the two? So let me just run through probably the most famous case that I'm sure that you all the audience, all members of the audience have encountered before. So there's this big experimental paradigm about how let's say Caucasians, but also non-Caucasians, they tend to mistake a handheld tool if it's held by a black person with a gun. So if there's images flashing quite quickly, and there's these people holding various things, I don't know, electric drill or hammer or whatever, and gun, and we are much more likely to somehow mistake, to kind of assume or have react in a way that the black person is holding a gun than the white person is holding a gun, or then the black person is holding a kind of different kind of tool. And then the question is, how can we explain this? How can we explain this? This is clearly a bias. I mean, we're not. This is something that's not that our cognition goes somehow wrong there. It's a mistake. It's something that some kind of miswiring is going on, and it's very systematic, and it clearly has to do with the skin color of the person. So the question is how we can explain that. And the two main explanations, the first one is that we have these propositions in our head that tell us that black people are dangerous. Black people are more likely to hold guns. And that's what lead to the behavior that when we see a black person holding a weapon, we are more likely to, I don't know, to react in a way that we run away or we engage with the situation. Whereas if a white person is holding the very same object, then we're going to be less likely to do that. So that's a propositional explanation, which I think that we have reason not to believe. The other one is some kind of association. So you have an association between a gun and a black person. And again, I think we have reasons to think that that's just not the case. What I want to say is that what's happening is that the mental imagery is being triggered. So you see the black person, and then you have this kind of top-down influenced mental imagery of the gun, which is involuntary, which is, to go back to your question, involuntary mental imagery. It's very much, it's an action guiding or action oriented imagery. It's very much kind of, it's triggering actions from you either to run away or to, or it can trigger these actions. And it's very much emotionally laden as well. It makes your heart beat faster. So, and then this is this involuntary mental imagery that kind of connects, that kind of makes this implicit bias happen. It's not a proposition and not an association. Sorry, I've been talking too much.
No, that's perfect. So I'm curious more about this. Do you have an answer for how the mind makes these associations between the ideas?
Right. So again, I'm going against the associationist explanation. So I don't think that there is like a strict association, but in some sense, there is clearly some kind of involuntary mental imagery triggered when I see a black person holding a tool then there's this mental imagery of a gun comes in, and to answer your question, what the way that's triggered, it clearly has to do with some kind of top-down information, so some kind of background assumptions. So yeah.
So you're against the proposition view and also against the association view.
Yeah. So I want to give this kind of third way, but it's not. So I think that there's going to be a lot of. I don't want to somehow exile the importance of the propositional view and the associationist view. I just want to say that there's this unexplored thing, the mental imagery, because if the question that you just asked, the previous question about why is it like that is the mental imagery of a gun that's being triggered? It's clearly some kind of more higher level representation that is involved in there. Now, is it a proposition? I'm not sure it's a proposition, but it's some kind of higher level representation that somehow connects guns and Black people.
Your idea of the third way also being important, is it as simple as saying that we can explain what's going on by pointing to mental imagery?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a lot of explanatory benefits to this way of doing things, and one of them. Well, let me just mention two of those. One of them is that many of the implicit biases. So how do we measure implicit bias? One way in which, kind of a traditional way in which we measure it is just questionnaire stuff, right? But there's also this micro behavior that we have all the time. Like, for example, where you move in the elevator, or when you're taking the questionnaire, whether you're keeping an eye contact with the person who's giving you the test or not. And that's going to depend a lot on whether the person who's giving you the test is what skin color that person has. So so these micro behaviors, they're going to be much more. That's going to be a very kind of fine-grained, perceptually guided behavior. That's going to be much easier to explain with the help of this kind of fine-grained perceptual phenomenon, mental imagery. But I think that the biggest, well, what I find the most interesting kind of connection between mental imagery and implicit bias is that is about what we do about implicit bias. So we noticed about 20 years ago that there's this thing, implicit bias, and that's been troubling people, including institutions. Hiring processes are clearly impacted by implicit bias, as does the decision of judges, and there's a lot of attempts to try to counteract implicit bias. Now, how do you counteract implicit bias? And it seems like just by telling you that, hey, you have implicit bias, that's not going to do much. It's also not going to do much to say that, hey, you have implicit bias, try to be, I don't know, unbiased, try to be balanced, try not to be biased. That's also not going to do much. And what's weird, or kind of seemingly weird, especially if you think that if you're a believer in the propositionalist explanation or the associationist explanation, is that mental imagery, right, or visual imagery rather, of various kinds is one of the most efficient ways of counteracting implicit bias. So visualizing outgroup faces, so visualizing faces of people who don't share your skin color, for example, or your gender, that would be a good way of counteracting implicit bias, as does putting yourself imaginatively in the avatar, in kind of this virtual reality scenario, avatar of a person with a different skin color. These things seem to work better than other ways of counteracting implicit bias. Why would they work if you believe in this kind of propositionalist or associationist way? Whereas I think I have a good way of understanding why. By the way, it's getting dark here. Should I turn on the light?
Sure. Thank you. Maybe it'll help enlighten us.
Right, exactly.
So it sounds like that if we accept your view that implicit bias is somehow under the umbrella of mental imagery, then we have an efficient way of starting to control our implicit biases. And also in the reverse, we have a very plausible way of understanding the mind because it works in another sense.
Exactly. So I mean, so there's a certain ways of counteracting implicit bias that work. And the fact that they involve imagery is just completely bewildering unless you somehow have some kind of way of building in mental imagery and implicit bias. So, whereas I have a neat explanation for why it is that works. And if you do take the importance of mental imagery and implicit bias seriously, then you can actually kind of develop these ways of counteracting implicit bias further, so that can actually help even more. And one of the things that again, something that you mentioned before is about the voluntary involuntary stuff, right? So you were saying that, hey, in the Obama case, the mental imagery is involuntary, and that's exactly right. Whereas in the ways in which we're counteracting implicit bias, these implicit bias reversing procedures, they always kind of ask you to have a certain kind of mental imagery. So, hey, close your eyes and imagine Martin Luther King or something like that. And the problem with that is that it's kind of difficult to control whether you're actually doing that or not, right? So I might ask you to that, and you're closing your eyes. But what do I know whether you're actually doing it? And even if you do it, I mean, if you ask me to visualize the face of Martin Luther King, I could like really actively really pay attention and really conjure up the image of Martin Luther King, or I could just have this kind of flash of Martin Luther King Jr.'s face, and that's it. Huge difference, right? So it's very difficult to maintain the kind of voluntary mental imagery, and it's very difficult to control. Whereas if it's involuntary, especially if it's this kind of cross-modally triggered mental imagery, then it's much easier to control and much easier to maintain. So I think that if we do take on board this suggestion that mental imagery has a lot to do with implicit bias, then we can actually make these procedures much more efficient, and it's going to just help us fight implicit bias.
And it sounds like such a practical application of thought experiments and philosophy. That's very nice.
Yeah, I think of philosophy as not having a lot to do with thought experiments, or having a lot to do with actual experiments. So philosophy, I think, should be in dialogue with the empirical sciences, and if it's not, then it's not much, especially in philosophy of mind. So it's I think that's what philosophy should do, to give this kind of testable, practical predictions.
I happen to agree. So we've been focusing a lot on the perception modality, though you have mentioned auditory and other sense modalities. Is there a sense in which your view of implicit bias as mental imagery is important for those other modalities, or is it significant because of the perception thing?
Oh, you mean the visual? Which means visual?
Yeah, sorry,
So we've been focusing on visual modality, and humans, they tend to overrate vision as the most important sense modality. And yeah, the example that I gave about the gun was about vision, but the other sense modalities are going to be as important. So I would like to be completely, I would like to treat the sense modalities in the exact same way. So I think the auditory mental imagery is going to be as important, and even olfactory, tactile imagery. So I'd like to keep all of them in the game. I think all sense modalities are of the same importance, okay, really.
So maybe something like, if you grow up listening to music that really puts one group of people down, and you have that as your earworm, this is cognitive bias, implicit bias. And if we focus on the auditory implicit biases, we can use our mental imagery to counteract by listening to positive music with positive lyrics, and then change the way we behave. Could I say something like that? Is that analogous to the visual perception?
It's going to be much more difficult to find convincing examples in the auditory sense modality, because, I mean, I said that, I want to treat all the sense modalities in the same, as being equally important. But it's got to be said that humans are just very visual creatures. Mm-hmm. So much of these connections are going to be made in the visual modality. But I just want to leave open the possibility that it's going to work in the other case. So okay, let me just give you another example that might kind of be more which is more consistent with the importance of non-visual sense modalities. So it's also implicit bias that when we think of, let's say, caregivers, then we think of women, right? And you can have a propositionalist explanation of this, that you have some kind of proposition stored in your head that says that caregivers are, homemakers are women, or are likely to be women, or something like that. Or you could, the associationist explanation is that you have this kind of association between these two concept of caregiver and concept of being a woman. What I want to say is that it's just it's a mental imagery thing. So if you hear the word caregiver or something like that, you read it in a book, then you get a flash of mental imagery, and that's going to be of a woman. But that can be a face of a woman, can be very indeterminate, of course. It can be the woman's sound, or something like that, and so on. So it does not have to be just visual, right? So that's the thought.
Okay.
Again, it's likely to have a lot of visual stuff because we're visual creatures, but it could be auditory, olfactory.
Okay, my last question will be very open-ended. If there's one thing you want people at home watching to remember about implicit bias as mental imagery, what do you think is like the key thing to remember?
Well, I actually want to say that mental imagery is just a really important feature of the human mind, and it plays a crucial role in much of the things that we do. So it's not surprising that it's part of implicit bias as well, because it's part of almost everything that we do. I think it plays a constitutive role in desires, in our emotions, obviously in perception. It has a lot of, it plays an extremely important role in perception, in pain management, in action execution, in cognitive dissonance, and so on. So this is mental imagery is kind of the great underrated concept that's been missing, I think, from our philosophy of mind. So we should really take that more seriously. So I guess that would be my take-home message.
Thank you.
Okay.